Father, your prophecies always prove true. Your description of Alexander the Great was amazingly accurate and detailed. When Alexander saw what Daniel wrote 200 years earlier, he changed his mind, and instead of destroying the temple, he entered in peace to worship. All your word is truth, not only what you said about the future, but how you have instructed us to live today. Help us to be astonished as Alexander was when we see the wisdom in the Bible for daily living. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, last week we began Daniel chapter 8, and that was Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat. We learned why Daniel was so confident back in chapter 5 when he read the handwriting on the wall and interpreted that. So this week, our topic is Alexander the Great, and we'll be starting in Daniel 8, verse 5 through 7, about the goat from the west with one horn. I'll read those verses. As I was considering, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram. He was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. The ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. So David Jeremiah, speaking about these verses, says that it's one of the most amazing passages I've ever read in the prophetic word. We go back to the founding of Greece. The first Greek colony was established by an oracle, and that was a man who claimed that he spoke for the gods. Now, if you think about the Bible prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, these were prophets of the true God, and when they would say, "Thus saith the Lord," they were speaking the words of the true God. This is what was going on in the context of the Greek mythology. So you had these false gods like Zeus and Apollo and Athena. And in that area, there would be people that proclaimed they were speaking for those false gods. They were the oracles. So the oracle said that I'm going to send out a goat, and that goat is going to decide where we should build the first city. And so the goat traveled around until he came to the coast, and that's where they built this original capital city, Macedon. And it's on the shore of the land that we call Greece today. Very beautiful if you've seen pictures. It's just, the scenic beauty is amazing all around Greece and the islands in the water near Greece. But they were so grateful that the goat led them to this beautiful place to build that they named it AG, and that stands for the Goat City, named after the goat. And the water off the shore there, they call that the Aegean Sea. So the Goat Sea, and that's still the name that we use today for that body of water. The goat became their national symbol for ancient Greece, and Alexander had a son with Roxana that he named Aegis, the son of the goat. So there were 5 just amazing prophecies that we'll see in 4 verses today, starting with verse 5 through 7, and then also in verse 8 near the end. And they were all literally fulfilled 200 years later after Daniel wrote, down to the last detail. And we'll kind of break it up into these topics. The first one is the speed of the conquest, how quickly Alexander was able to conquer this territory. And then the reputation of the king, Alexander's reputation, and the fall of Medo-Persia when he defeated that army, and then the death of King Alexander, and finally the division of Alexander's kingdom into those 4 parts, all in these 5 verses of prophecy. So looking first at the speed of the conquest, the male goat represents the king of Greece, and then this prominent first horn represents the first king of Greece. That's confirmed to us when we get down to verse 21 in chapter 8. And 200 years after Daniel had this vision, Alexander the Great became that first king. I'm reading now from the book of Maccabees, and I'll just mention that there are several books that are included in the Catholic Bible that are not included in our Protestant Bible of 66 books. And I'll send a link today after the lesson where we talk about that and kind of go back to some of the debates that Martin Luther had with the Catholic scholars back when the Protestant Reformation first began. But I'll just say that these books are not inspired scripture. They don't belong in the Bible, and yet they do record some history, particularly about that period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So you have the end of the Old Testament there in Malachi, and then there's a period of 400 years where there was no Jewish prophet, and then the books of the New Testament begin to appear. So these books were written during and about that period in between the Testaments. So this is the very beginning of 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 1 from the Catholic Bible. And it says, "After Alexander, the son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, after Alexander had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king, and he had previously become king of Greece. And then when he conquered the Persians and the Medes, he became king over that territory as well." So the Greek Empire, it's larger than any of the previous empires. So Alexander conquered more territory than Nebuchadnezzar, more than Cyrus or Darius or any of the Persian kings. And Alexander came from the west, and he built this kingdom very, very quickly. He conquered all these lands with tremendous speed. It only took 12 years, and the Greek army was able to conquer the known world, the civilized world at that time, and never lost a battle during those 12 years. And thinking now about the reputation of the king, from the time Alexander was a boy, his mother would read to him and taught him that he descended from these heroes, from Achilles and Hercules. A lot of mothers read stories to their children about heroes. You might read a book about George Washington or any hero that you might think of. But when she would read these stories to young Alexander, she was talking about those false gods, the gods of Greek mythology. And she would say, not only is this an inspiring story about being a hero, but she would tell him, you descended from these people. You are the offspring of these gods. And he believed it from earliest childhood. So one example of that, when he was just a boy, he was able to break a wild horse after all of the adults, all of the men in the family had tried and failed. And when I say broke the horse, we're not saying he damaged a horse. If you all are familiar with, you see these Western movies and the cowboys, before you can put a saddle on the horse, before you can use the horse to, pull a wagon full of plow, work the fields, you have to get the horse comfortable with the idea of a saddle and a human rider on his back. And when they find a wild horse, it's like a bucking bronco, like watching a bull ride at the rodeo. The horse is going to kick and do everything he can to get that rider off his back. But Alexander, you might think he's the first horse whisperer. He was able to go up and explain to the horse that you're going to be my horse, and whether you like it or not, that's the way it's going to be. And he broke that horse, and that is the horse that Alexander rode as he led the Greek army on their conquest of the world. His father, Philip of Macedon, also a famous, successful military leader, and Alexander was afraid that there would be nothing left for him to conquer because his dad was so successful conquering all these territories around Macedonia. And so one day, Philip had a particularly large victory and he had conquered a big territory, but Alexander was discouraged about it. And he said, Dad, you're not leaving me anything. There's nothing left for me to do. And a father who knew just what to say to his son to inspire him and encourage him, the father said, Alexander, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself. Macedonia is too small for you. And so from that point on, Alexander broadened his vision, the scope of what he thought he could accomplish. And he set his eyes on conquering the world, realizing that he could stand on his father's shoulders, he could build on that success and extend that kingdom even beyond Macedonia. So Alexander conquered the largest amount of land in history any king ever conquered. And just to kind of help you visualize, imagine 1 acre of land. Now, most homes, let's say in subdivision, they might have a 1/4 acre lot or 1/3 of an acre, something like that. But a square mile has 640 acres. So that's a box that's 1 mile wide and 1 mile tall. City of Greenville, within the city limits, that territory is around 30 square miles. And what Alexander conquered was over 1,500,000 square miles, 1.5 million square miles. And they did that by marching all the way from Europe to India and back, 11,000 miles that they traveled in those conquests. So now the fall of Medo-Persia, it says that the goat attacked in a great rage. It's more than just a military battle. And so this is furiously striking and shattering both of the ram horns. And there's some revenge involved here because there was bad blood between Persia and Greece going way back. Persia had conquered Greece about 150 years earlier, before Alexander, and they had just devastated the land when they conquered. So Alexander is really retaliating here. He's wiping out Medo-Persia as he conquers it. And that went on for about 3 years, from 334 down to 331 BC. And those verses were literally fulfilled in history, starting in May of 334. Alexander was only 22 years old at the time, but he defeated the Persians. There was a battle there at the Granicus River, Asia Minor. It's the land we call Turkey. And if you've been here, the Wednesday night studies, we talk about the churches of Revelation, that general area. And his complete conquest took just over 3 years. He defeated all of the Persian Empire. They finally were broken in October of 331 BC, near Nineveh. And that's the area where the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom of Israel captive. It's up in the northern part. And so it's the last large-scale attempt that you see in history where the East tried to defeat the West. But from this point on, you see Europe and the western part of Asia dominant over Iran and that area. And the Greek army, they only had 35,000 soldiers, so they were outnumbered 10-1, and yet they crushed the Persian army. It was not a close game at all. They routed the Persians, even though the Persians had 10 times the number of soldiers. And the ram without horns was powerless. It really became at the mercy of the goat, but there was no mercy. So Daniel adds a little humor there at the end that none could rescue the ram. And I'm comparing verse 7 with what we said back in verse 4 last time, that no one could rescue from the ram's power. When the Persians were in charge, they conquered everything, and they were just devastating. But now along comes Alexander, and he conquers them like they were nothing. So when Alexander was on his way home and going to conquer Jerusalem at that time, there was a Jewish priest that rode out to meet him named Jadua. This was in 332 BC, recorded by the historian Josephus. And this priest showed Alexander the prophecies that had been written about him in the Daniel scroll. And so clearly Josephus believed that Daniel was written before 332 BC when this happened. Alexander was impressed. He saw this description of himself written 200 years earlier. And so instead of destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple, he came in peace and worshiped there at the temple. So this prophecy also corresponds to some later history that we'll get into in chapter 11 with amazing accuracy. And for now, I'll just mention that when we get to chapter 11, those first 35 verses really put the microscope on this period of history. From Bible school, it said that zoom in on this period of history. And what they're explaining is in those 35 verses, here are 135 specific prophecies. So this king will do this, and talking about the kings of Syria and the kings of Egypt that descend from Alexander the Great. And then it says, but this king's daughter will marry this king's son, and they'll do this and that. 135 specific prophecies. And then as history goes on, they're all literally fulfilled in order. Number one came true, then number two came true. And the historians, the people that are experts on the history of Syria and ancient Egypt, can sit down with their history book beside Daniel 11 and draw the lines and show you it's this person, it's this person, and this person. No question, no doubt at all that that's what Daniel was saying. And so you ask those unbelievers, well, why don't you believe the Bible? Why don't you believe Daniel is true? And the fit is so perfect. The only argument they have is that it had to have been written in 165 BC or later. They say that, oh, it's absolutely true, but they believe Daniel's looking at history books and newspapers and, whatever sources he could find and making up this fairy tale about what happened. The problem with that is that the copy of Daniel that we had in the Dead Sea Scrolls is older than that date, and the original Daniel scroll was even older than that copy. So they don't like to talk about Daniel anymore. All right, so let's move on to verse 8. This is the goat horn is broken. Daniel chapter 8, verse 8. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So now we come to that topic about the death of the king Alexander and then the way his kingdom was divided into 4 parts. Alexander began to push toward India, but the army was exhausted, and you can imagine if you've been marching with backpacks for 11,000 miles, you might get a little winded. And so they demanded rest, and the place where they stopped was Babylon, of all places. And unexpectedly here, this great horn Alexander is going to be broken right at the peak of the goat's strength as he's conquering more and more territory. Prophecy was fulfilled. It was in June of 323 BC. Alexander died at the age of 32, very young. And he died in a drunken party there at Babylon, just like Belshazzar in chapter 5. Same situation. So Alexander had conquered the known world at that time, and yet he was not able to conquer his own sinful excesses, his desire for alcohol and other pleasures. So this Greek empire was divided, and that happened in 301 BC. They split it into 4 sections led by the 4 different army generals, just as Daniel predicted, and I give you some verses there, going back to chapter 7 and then later in verse 22 of this chapter. And Alexander believed that he deserved all the credit for his conquest, just like Nebuchadnezzar believed that initially. And I remember that from earliest childhood, Alexander believed that he was the son of Superman and believed that he could do whatever he wanted, that he had superpowers, and that it was all about his glory. But Alexander did not realize that he was an instrument in God's hand, just as Nebuchadnezzar was and just as Cyrus was. And you can kind of work your way down the list, all of these rulers throughout history. God gives authority to all leaders. So he was an instrument in God's hand, and he was actually doing what God had sent him to do, even though his motive was selfish, to do it for his own glory. He didn't know, but he had to complete these conquests and the work that he did before the Messiah would come. And the secular historians, they write all these books and articles about Alexander the Great, but there's 2 things that they typically neglect to mention, and you'll only find this in Christian resources. The 2 greatest contributions that Alexander made in world history is that he built this vast network of highways throughout the known world. And everywhere that he went, they were blazing trails. They were making room for the armies to travel. Places where you used to have to go through the woods and take a machete and cut your way through the jungle and move trees out of the way to get through. He made roads between all these cities. Now later the Romans would come along and improve these roads. We would think like paving a road or making it interstate, but it was the Greek army that cut the roads and the pathways initially. And ultimately, these are the roads that missionaries would travel. So when you think about the early church, and you get to the end of Acts chapter 7, there's the death of Stephen and the persecution that broke out. And so the early church scattered in every direction, and they were traveling on these roads that the Greek built, going out from Jerusalem into the world at that point. And then the other thing Alexander did was establish the language in which the gospel would be written and preached. So the New Testament written in Greek, it was the language Alexander established. Everywhere that he went, he did not allow the people to continue speaking their native tongue. They all had to learn Greek, and they all had to start writing in Greek. So he enforced that throughout the known world. And this went on for 300 years before and after Christ. So Alexander did not realize he was being used that way, and Greek became the universal language for centuries before and centuries after. And you think about back in the days when people would take shorthand, come in with a tablet and write down what the person is saying, put in some memo, or you think about the way that a doctor writes a prescription for a pharmacy with all these little dots and dashes and things that the rest of us can't read. It's a very efficient language. Greek language is extremely precise and uses fewer words. It's really about 20% shorter than English. If you take a New Testament written in English and a New Testament written in Greek, and if the pages are the same size and the font is the same size, everything's identical except the language, the Greek New Testament will be a thin little book compared to our English New Testament. So that was very important because they didn't have computers, they didn't have printers, they didn't have Xerox copiers. If you wanted a copy of the New Testament letter, it had to be written by hand. And paper was expensive, and people that could write as scribes were not very common at that time to have that education. So New Testament was written in Greek that way so that it could be easily understood. You could just make a copy and send it out in any direction, anywhere from Europe to India, and everybody would be able to read it and understand it if they had been educated in Greek language, according to what Alexander had done. And this absence of language barriers, that's really what facilitated the explosive growth in the early church. And of course, the Holy Spirit is behind it all, starting at Pentecost in Acts 2, and then the church continued to grow explosively. But in order for people to come to saving faith, they needed to hear or read the gospel. And so that was how God facilitated that, by spreading it in Greek throughout the empire Alexander had conquered. And it's really the best language ever devised for communicating the rich message that you had. And I'll just add one comment here that years ago when I was first doing some serious Bible research, and I was looking at some things like alleged discrepancies, people would point out, they would read a verse in the Old Testament, they'd read a verse in the New Testament, and they'd say, how can both of these be true? And it turns out that almost all of those alleged discrepancies are resolved when you go back to the original, to the Greek language, and you understand what that Greek word actually was saying. And so in most cases, it's just due to a mistranslation in English that was not clear, not precise enough. So I studied Greek at that time and worked with the person who taught me Greek was someone who had worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls on that translation, and really had a wonderful opportunity to get off on a good foot there. That was in the early 90s, so that's been almost 35 years ago. But I'll just say that next week we're going to look at this little boy in Daniel chapter 8, and he's the king of Syria, a person named Antiochus Epiphanes. The persecution that he did against the Jews was just terrible, but it also foreshadows what the Antichrist will do in the end times. So he's kind of a little picture of what will come in those last days. This evil king Antiochus, he desecrated the temple in Jerusalem 168 BC. And God did such an amazing miracle following that to restore the temple that the Jews still celebrate it to this day. It's their Feast of Hanukkah in December. So I hope to see you next week.